Okay, welcome back to another contextualized reading for Hamlet. We are doing Act 4 in this one, and I'm going to tie up hopefully some of the loose ends that I left from my talk on Act 3, particularly the interest that I have in Ophelia. And I'm going to give a little bit more of my interpretation at various points in this lecture. But just to go into Act 4, Scene 1 here, we saw at the end of Act 3, it seemed like Hamlet was getting through to Gertrude, and maybe not so in Act 4 here. So Gertrude immediately confides in Claudius. She thinks that Hamlet's gone off, off the rails, or he's completely mad. Claudius identifies himself at this point with Polonius again in the play. This is quite interesting. So we find out that Polonius is dead. And immediately what Claudius does is he says, "It had been so with us had we been there." And he's referring to himself, right? If I were with Polonius, I would have died. And so again, like he sees Hamlet and Hamlet's actions as a direct threat to his own being. But why should Claudius ever have been hiding in his wife's bedroom in the first place, right? So it actually shows this kind of sway that Polonius has on Claudius. And so Claudius is going to become a plotter and an intriguer, as we will see in later acts. Here again, I do kind of disagree with Wilson Knight. I don't personally think that Claudius is life and Hamlet is death. That binary that Wilson Knight brings up, I do think it's intriguing and worth thinking about, but I tend to not think that Claudius is a good king. As I said in earlier lectures, I don't think that he handles the Fortinbras situation with the kind of seriousness that I think that he should. I think he's obsessed with Hamlet. And he's been in a close relationship with the most narcissistic character, who's a fool the entire time. I think Polonius is a fool. And Claudius, who was just repenting, also refuses here to believe Gertrude when she says that Hamlet is sorry for murdering Polonius. So here's the repenter who refuses to believe in someone else's repentance. We get Scene 2, Act 4, and we get the interrogation of Hamlet for the body of Polonius. Hamlet calls out Rosencrantz and Guildenstern for their ambition and for their alliance with Claudius in this scene. And then he tells them the body is with the king, but the king is not with the body. This again is going to be a reference to the idea of the king's two bodies, and I'm going to elaborate on that more in Richard II through another famous critic who wrote a book about it. But I just want to sort of point out there that theme is at work throughout this play as well. And Hamlet has become more and more bold in the sense that he says that he's been calling into question now the legitimacy of Claudius's ascension to power. In Scene 3, Claudius notes that the multitude loves Hamlet, and it's therefore dangerous for him personally, and for the state if Hamlet goes loose. So that's a pretty interesting thing. I think that we could read that also against Wilson Knight's characterization of Hamlet as a Superman, and therefore being implicitly anti-democratic. Although maybe not, I don't know. But he is, Hamlet does not appear to be hated by the people. We get famous lines in this section on worms. This might again refer to the diet of worms. So Hamlet collapses the roles of king and beggar, and so we see this over and over again throughout the play. I've been alluding to it. Fortune's wheel, or the wheel of fortune, it gets collapsed, but the king, in the medieval schema, the king is at the top, the beggar's at the bottom, and the force of fate is going to topple the king. Nothing truly lasts, and things tend to be rather cyclical. But what the time out of joint being in this play is that there is no suspension. Like, the spokes on the wheel are broken, right? And so we see these lines that show up. Remember the players' lines about Dido, right? About that if we could see her shrieks, or Hecuba. So Hecuba and Dido and Ophelia are all sort of working together as different kinds of types, I think, in the play, and definitely the allusions to Dido and to Hecuba at the slaying of Priam earlier. Yes, she's the queen, but the moment of just utter pity, I think, that we could have for an individual's particular situation, I think, happens at various happens to layer, I think, a bit on Ophelia. And in that sense, I think that the part that Ophelia plays in this play, although people have constantly commented on the limitations that she has, the lack of agency that she seems to have, I want to say that the play maybe gives her more than some critics have chosen. And it means that we have to think about gender, and we have to think a little bit different than maybe we conventionally think about it. But again, if we go back to the scene here, Hamlet collapses the role of the king and the beggar, and then scholars also have said that he might be playing on the diet of worms, which is when Martin Luther was exiled from the Catholic Church. Claudius does admit here that he sent Hamlet to England to be murdered. So that's Act 4, Scene 3, about lines 65 to 68. And then we get a segue to Fortinbras. This is really interesting, right? Where we see Hamlet sees Fortinbras's troops, and we see this kind of comparison that he makes between himself as being the person unable to act, and Fortinbras, who is the son who can act. So sometimes Shakespeare scholars have thought of Fortinbras, and that the whole character could be deleted from the play, from different stages of the play, and that maybe that Fortinbras was added in later. I don't really think so. I mean, you can, try and come up with your own reading for sure, but I think that Fortinbras is a really important foil to Hamlet, and a foil, of course, gives more of a shape to the characterization that's going on. So the exchange here with the captain and Hamlet allows Hamlet to comment on the worldly matters of the state. And we see that there's been a kind of expanding out. Yes, in Act 1, something's rotten in the state of Denmark, it's mentioned. And so Fortinbras is in relation that way. We've seen that Hamlet has become, in Claudius's language, a threat to the state of Denmark, and that's why he must be killed. But Hamlet himself, as he's questioned Claudius's legitimacy to his rule, he seems to be thinking more himself as a ruler here. So I think that the Fortinbras connection is quite important. It heightens the doubling of Hamlet's inaction against the ambition of Fortinbras. And then it hastens the fourth soliloquy here. So let me find that. It's in 4.4. And just as usual, just out of deference to the beautiful language, I want to read the entire thing out. And it's less commented on, this fourth soliloquy. The third one, of course, was the famous to be or not to be speech. And so Rosencrantz says, "Will you go? Will it please you go, my lord?" Hamlet says, "I'll be with you straight. Go a little before." And Hamlet has just had this exchange with the captain, right? So here we go. "How all occasions do inform against me, and spur my dull revenge. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast, no more. Sure he that made us with such large discourse," again, reference to God and God making us speak, right? Euro-Christian. "Sure he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. Now, whether it be bestial oblivion or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quartered hath but one part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward, I do not know why yet I live to say this and do this things to do, since I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. Examples gross as earth exhort me, witness this army of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffed, makes mouths at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honour's at the stake. How stand I then, that have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep, while to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men, that for a fantasy and a trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody, or be nothing worth." And so he seems to have talked himself into a kind of active moment at this point. He seems to have made a decision, at least he says that that's what his thoughts will be. And then we get the scene cut back to the castle here, right? So I think we might think, like, especially if we just pulled out the soliloquies and see this kind of the development of Hamlet's decision or his coming, so it was like nostalgia, outward directed, in soliloquy 1, inner directed, self-loathing, in soliloquy 2, conscience driven, but like that confined to a nutshell and king of infinite space. That the conscience driven Hamlet is then pushes back outward in soliloquy 3, and then in soliloquy 4 here, he's looking out on the politics of the state. He's not even in the castle anymore, right? And he's seeing how men have been endowed with reason. So there's a reference to Renaissance humanism here, but it's Euro-Christian humanism as well, right? That God gave man reason, and that God gave man reason for a particular purpose, a particular providence or divine plan, and that divine plan allows us to fight over the smallest things, the things that seem like a straw, the minutiae and yet and to give our lives willingly up for something, even if it seems absurd. It's the ability to commit to something, and therefore Hamlet himself will commit to action as well, because he has greater cause, he says, than all of these kind of soldiers that are just going off to fight for this nothing piece of land. So Act 4, Scene 5, we get an interesting scene here between the Queen and Horatio. We just don't see Horatio talking to that many other people, right? So the Queen and Horatio are talking, and they're regarding Ophelia, and this is rarely. I don't think it gets commented on a lot, and I just think that it deserves a little bit of attention here. So Ophelia now is the one who's become mad, and she seems full on mad. Yet, like Hamlet, there seems to also be something more in her madness, and maybe that's part of madness itself, right? I had the unfortunate experience of being around somebody who's really mentally ill, and to the state where they're not really seeing reality. And unfortunately, a friend of mine that I grew up with got diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and when he had not been diagnosed and he was not on medication and he was really delusional, it's a pretty scary thing. And yet, people say really smart and astounding things, in their madness. And so maybe that's just part of what madness is. Her songs here hint about pregnancy, and I mentioned in an earlier contextualized reading that there's a way, I think, to read Ophelia as being pregnant. Hamlet does, say to Polonius that she may conceive. Many stagings of the place, show them as lovers, Ophelia and Hamlet as lovers who have already consummated their relationship, so they've already had sex. There is the letters to Ophelia that say, doubt the stars before you doubt my love for you. And so that seems to precede all of the weirdness that Hamlet is going through. So I'm going to focus a little bit on Ophelia here. Hamlet alluded to the fact that she might conceive. Ophelia's lines around Act 4.5, 68 to 72, if we look at them here. I hope all will be well. We must be patient, but I cannot choose but weep to think they would lay him in the cold ground. My brother shall know of it, and so I thank you for your good counsel. Come, my coach. Good night, ladies. Ladies, good night. Sweet ladies, good night. Good night. And we could think that she's been talking about her father at this point, because she's it's like, well, did Polonius's death really set her off? Or I'm going to suggest the fact that Ophelia, like Hamlet in these lines, also seems to know Hamlet's fate in England. She seems to know that he's going to die. Now just think about it. If you're a woman in this moment, and we've already seen the kind of wrath of patriarchy going on, but she's lost her dad, her brother's away. Hamlet, who is her lover, for sure, and potentially a father of a baby, if we imagine Ophelia is pregnant here. Being pregnant by a dead prince out of wedlock and fatherless, Ophelia is pretty darned destitute. Laertes had already warned her, and his warnings would not make him a really suitable source of comfort, I think, for Ophelia. And Claudius here in this scene, he's still kind of orbiting Polonius, even though Polonius is dead. And he sees Ophelia's loss of sanity only in relation to his death first. We learn that Laertes has stirred up the people in support of his own claim to the crown in this section. And in some ways, I think that we could follow. There's a famous and problematic, I think, critic named Carl Schmitt, who wrote a book called Hamlet or Hecuba in the 1950s. And he also wrote a political theology, a famous book called Political Theology in 1922, became a famous Nazi and anti-Semite, but had all sorts of exchanges around Hamlet with really important Jewish thinkers like Walter Benjamin, who shows up in this. Benjamin dies famously trying to escape the Nazis in the early 40s, but the dialogue with Benjamin, this dead Jewish writer, comes back in Carl Schmitt's book Hamlet or Hecuba here, and their argument tends to be about how to read revenge plays or mourning plays. They're called Trauerspiels in German, and this is what Walter Benjamin, one of the most famous critics of the 20th century, had written his dissertation on. Or his habilitation on, that's what it's called in Europe. He famously did not pass, and that we see that there's perhaps some anti-Semitism going on for him not being able to work as a professor. He dies quite destitute trying to get to the United States, trying to cross the border from Spain into Portugal. And so, if you don't know, if you've never heard Carl Schmitt's name before, he has come into fashion in the past 20 years for various reasons that I can't go into in today's talk. But his reading of various forms of literature is reflective of this ongoing conversation around law and politics and borders and political theory in general. So we might follow some of Schmitt's reading, I think, here. Claudius has disrupted the rightful succession while aligning with Polonius. Laertes would now usurp power. And at the same time, the population support for Laertes would seem kind of democratic. And in denying that Laertes gets it, right, is Shakespeare himself anti-democratic? This is something that we want to think about, back in that discussion in relation to Plato and Aristotle and art's place, if we're trying to figure out what Shakespeare is saying about art's place in society. Is Shakespeare himself a Democrat? Now, I think it's a little bit ridiculous to try and read a post-Enlightenment kind of modern Western liberal democracy back onto Shakespeare, but it's useful to point out, to do the thought work, because I think a lot of times what we do as readers in the 21st century is we map back onto characters ideas that we have, and this has particularly happened, I think, with people who mapped certain desires about women's liberation, for example, onto Ophelia, which I kind of want to take a reading that situates Ophelia in her particular place here as well. So I leave it up to you to decide, but of course, yeah, we probably ought not read Shakespeare as if he were anticipating 18th century revolutions in Europe, but is the vision of power that Shakespeare wants to see a democratic version of power. Ophelia then enters in this scene with Laertes, and this is where she seems to be quoting old songs. Who was doing this earlier in the play? Hamlet, right? Is doing it in Act 3 especially. So there might be some really nice comparisons to do there. Unfortunately, it seems like a lot of the songs that are being referenced, we don't have access to the full text from them. So it would take some massive amounts of folkloric work to dig there. But it's a looking kind of backwards. She seems to me to be referring also to Fortune's Wheel. And so I want to point us to Act 4, Scene 5, and this is going to be line about 174 here. Ophelia says, "You must sing a down, and you call him a down-a. Oh, how the wheel it becomes it. It is the false steward that stole his master's daughter." Laertes says, "There's nothing more than matter." Ophelia says, "There's rosemary. That's for remembrance. Pray you, love, remember. And there's pansies. That's for thoughts." A document and madness, says Laertes. Thoughts and remembrance fitted. Ophelia says, "There's fennel for you and columbines. There's rue for you, and here's some for me. We may call it herb of grace of Sundays. You may wear your rue with a difference. There's a daisy. I would give you some violets, but they withered all when my father died. They say I made a good end." There is a reference earlier in the play to violets back to, and I believe it's in Act 1, and maybe that's a place for you to dig into to see if that's a moment of the tightly woven text that I've talked about in earlier contextualized readings here. Or does it just happen to be that violets is repeated? Laertes says, "Thought and afflictions, passion, hell itself she turns to favor and to prettiness." She's so beautiful in her madness. And then she's singing these words, "And will it not come again, and will it not come again? No, he's dead. Go to thy deathbed. He never will come again." Again, she seems to have just referenced her father and her father's death. Is she also doubly thinking of Hamlet's death as well? It is when Hamlet leaves, but it's also the death of her father that she seems to lose her mind. Here, his beard was white as snow, all flaxen with his poll. He is gone, and we cast away moan. God a mercy on his soul. And of all Christian souls, I pray God be with you. It's very interesting that Hamlet kills her father, right? Hamlet can't kill his own father, or Claudius, and so he takes hers. Just a different. It's like, well, what are you thinking, Roger? Like, these are just different possibilities of ways of thinking about the text. They won't always work out for you in your reading, but I think it's good to have the kind of flexibility there. Again, yes, she overtly seems to be talking about her father. Is she also mourning the loss of Hamlet? It's a question to have there. Definitely that reference to Fortune's Wheel is really interesting there, because it does seem to be doing different work than the way Hamlet, when he constantly seems to be collapsing Fortune's Wheel here, where she seems to be seeing that kind of faded moment. Oh, how the wheel becomes it. It is the false steward that stole his master's daughter. There's a note in my text that says, "The story is unknown, but false stewards do sometimes steal their master's daughters in romance tales." Perhaps Ophelia is madly fantasizing about her father's uneasy fear that Hamlet might, in effect, steal her away by seducing her. And so, yes, I do think that the relationship to Hamlet sort of needs to make its way in here as well. But she is destitute, I think. Laertes is, of course, appalled. Claudius offers up his kingdom at this point. This is, again, one of the moments where I think Claudius is not the greatest king. He just isn't. Because here Laertes comes and Claudius says, I'll give you the kingdom if Laertes can prove that he's right, that Claudius was, out to murder Polonius. And it's like, would a king really address the threat of the traitor in this particular way? Of course he has sympathy. Of course he loved Polonius, all of that sort of stuff here. But it's a pretty extreme thing to say, like, oh, you can have the state. This is how I'm going to calm you down. So Claudius is quite accommodating. We get scene 6. Horatio here is again with a sailor who receives a letter from Hamlet. The scenes here, the scenes on the boat and what happens with Hamlet is sometimes referred to as Deus ex machina, or God or the ghost in the machine, which is this kind of turn of events that seem to sort of be magical, and they happen off scene or off stage. And it completely turns the whole direction of the play. Laertes and Claudius show up again in scene 7, Act 4. Claudius explains his deceptions. Gertrude and the people love Hamlet too much for him to do it himself. So this is why he had to send him to England. So he's making kinds of, again, this kind of like, maybe it's an allusion to like to not having a very good hold on his power. And so again, if I go back to the Wilson Knight thing, this is just a disagreement I have with Wilson Knight about whether or not Claudius may represent sort of flawed life against Hamlet representing death. But I don't, Claudius's life is not a life that I find acceptable. Laertes here doubles Hamlet in being driven toward revenge. Interestingly, Claudius now becomes the intriguer, the plotter. Polonius is dead, and now we get the Claudius play. He steps in for the dead Polonius. As they talk, it appears that Ophelia drowns herself. So I want to just take a pause here for gender critique before getting to Act 5. And then because I think that constantly, and this is something, I'm not going to decide it today, people talk about the ways that Ophelia gets treated badly in the play, and is the play misogynist? Is it woman-hating? Is it just that Hamlet's woman-hating? And I just want to offer a different possible reading here. So the conventionally restrictive impulses that are often projected onto Ophelia are oftentimes reactionary. Sometimes it's a way of wanting, to read our 21st century feminist sensibilities, like, which I will admit I'm a feminist. I believe in the social equality of women in all sorts of ways. So this is not an argument against feminists at all, but I do want a deeper reading of the text. And I asked this question, and it's going to allow us to think a little bit more about the Euro-Christian worldview that I've been articulating and talking about in various lectures. So just go with me here. Why can't Ophelia's suicide just be a fuck you to her own society? Is it just tragic? And here I'm wanting Ophelia am I reading in saying that I want her, like, why can't we read her thing as a fuck you? Am I casting a kind of masculine gaze? Am I wanting her to be a kind of man? Is it sexist for, um, or is it sexist to think that only men might desire to end their own lives? What I'm getting at here is that Ophelia is able to do what Hamlet is not able to do. Hamlet will contemplate till the day's end, to be or not to be, existence, death, any of that sort of stuff. But Ophelia does it. And I think that that's something, maybe this is my own sort of disposition, on whether or not, there are cases where it's right for somebody to take their own lives. Of course, as the play comments on in the Euro-Christianity of the play in Act 5, is going to say all of these things about Ophelia's soul. But I see this as an act, that Hamlet is incapable of. But oftentimes when we read the play, we blame Hamlet because Hamlet's a jerk to her. But in blaming Hamlet, we always already accept a kind of patriarchy. We accept that Hamlet has a kind of control over Ophelia. We don't then acknowledge Ophelia as an independent woman. So if we're thinking about gender critique or gendered readings of plays, the feminist question is, I think, can a woman character, and if we're talking about literature, for example, can a woman exist on her own without any sort of relation to the male gaze or male sexuality? Can she exist on her own? Can she live on her own? Can she be and exist in the world? And I'm not talking about this in like if we want to get to the nitty gritty of two people having to have had sex to produce the women themselves. Yes, I think that there's a way that we could bring in a kind of Emmanuel Levinas, to bring in an ethical philosopher, the ideas of sociality itself that we're born into, and that maybe, yes, I do think that sometimes the ways that we think about independence or being independent, maybe has a kind of absurd, there's a kind of way of thinking of the transcendence of freedom as being a little bit absurd when we are socially integrated and connected. And there are womanist critiques of the earlier feminist movement that I think that make those kinds of arguments as well. But I do think that the question is, can we, as feminists, can we look at a female character like Ophelia and see her acting on her own, and of her own mind? And if we're going to stage, if you were the actor who's playing Ophelia, right, how would you deal with her internality? In the same way that we can go back to Titania, or any of the women in Midsummer Night's Dream as well. So I'm not making an excuse for Hamlet, right? I do think, so it's not to say that Hamlet isn't a kind of like privileged white dude. Right? I think he is. But if you think that observation of just saying like, oh, like Hamlet's just another privileged white dude, if you think that's enlightening, I think that you need to do more thinking, right? Like white privileges is something that exists. It's a problem, especially for white men like myself. It's something that I have to deal with my own masculinity, and my own social formation. It's something that has to be consciously thought about and dealt with and wrestled with on a daily basis, because at the end of the night I could think that I've decolonized my own mind, or decolonized my white male privilege, and I'm going to wake up the next morning and it's going to be there like an infinite reservoir. And just because I've thought about or questioned my own white masculinity doesn't mean that when I walk out on the street it doesn't come to me in terms of social power, even when I don't want it to be. Like, even when I'm in like certain meetings and people like will gesture and look at me, like they won't, like it's almost like unconscious because like I happen to be a dude in the room or something. And maybe like, and it's my age, and maybe there's other factors as well. So I think just like I really want to resist just the pointing out like, oh, like oh, that person Hamlet's privileged, yes. That alone isn't enough for a critique. Of course he's privileged, but focusing on him, of course, doesn't still won't give you access to Ophelia. So if we're going to do gender critique in Hamlet or any of the Shakespeare plays, what we want to try and sort of pull into question as gender critics, is how gender critique is often, maybe too often, framed in heterosexual terms, so just between men and women. I think that we need to do a little bit more reading and thinking about how we think of women's empowerment or agency, and that kind of thinking, or like because I see this in student papers all the time, like they know to use the language of women's empowerment, or they want to find strong women characters, for example. Some of that reading and some of that language, the language around agency, feels very 1990s to me in terms of feminist critics. And we know that feminism has a whole history. There's first wave feminism, if I'm speaking in US terms, there's first wave feminism, which is the suffragist movement, the right to vote sort of thing. It kind of gets eaten up by the working, the workers' revolts of the 30s, and then we get Rosie the Riveter and characters like this in the 40s for women. They're part of the labor movement, you know. But then we get second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s, and the women's movement, and then third wave feminism in the 1990s, the kind of like the daughters of really important thinkers like Alice Walker, who gives us womanist critiques as well. So what I'm getting at here is that when we're bringing gender critique to a text, we don't want to just fall back on our own particular genders, as if like the fact that I'm a white man gives me access to all white men, or like it does give me some insight, right? Like I have some insight to how white male privilege works because of my social positioning, but that can't be the all of it. So if we're going to take a feminist position, which I have to take as somebody who's an outsider, I'm not a woman, right? Then I have to take, there's a kind of ethics to the ways that I commit to something like feminism. But in doing so, it's like it's important to see that there's been a long line of thought within gender studies and gender critiques and feminism. And we don't just get like, just because, you know, I don't know, if I take like a young woman, you know, like traditional college age student, that yes, there are things that she's grown up in a sexist society, for example, which is going to give her some insight into being a woman. But to only take that into our reading of a play or literature without acknowledging that there's a whole history of gender criticism and women's studies and feminist movement, then that becomes a problem. Then we've kind of essentialized our own position, and not taken seriously the fact that really important thinkers have thought about this stuff before. So I want to think about things in 21st century terms if we are going to do some gender criticism here. The mistakes that often happen, that I see my students doing when they are reading Hamlet, or other plays, they do it in my film classes all the time too, is first to think of gender violence only in heterosexual terms. It's just men versus women. So they don't think about trans anything, or non-binary folks. It's just like the way that the first sort of knee-jerk reaction to thinking about like female characters in books is not to think about them in terms of transgenders, and then heterosexual orientation as well, which is why I think it might be interesting to think of Horatio and Hamlet as lovers, and them being lovers doesn't have to exclude the fact that Ophelia and Hamlet might be lovers too, right? If we're thinking again, like a little bit like in more flexible types of relationships than heteronormativity might lend us. So I think that we don't want to be heteronormative in our critiques if we're doing gender critique. Second, I think that people oftentimes tend to rely on what I would call archaic notions of liberal democratic individualism. What do I mean by that? Well, again, it's that abstract notion of freedom. Abstract liberalism is one of, in a book called Racism Without Racist, by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Abstract liberalism is one of the identifying factors for him of whiteness. So like there are ways that like we don't want to read into our notions of liberation and liberal individualism. We want to see the ways that those notions might be raced in the same way, in addition to being gendered in particular ways. And one way to see this is to see like the womanist critiques that came out against the second wave feminist movement, which was seen very much as being kind of white women led, and Ms. Magazine. And these are really, really important thinkers. So I'm not at all trying to knock the white women who were doing this type of work, but definitely women of color started seeing that like their narratives as women were being excluded from this emphasis on women who go to work and they have what's a woman's salary compared to men's salary, right? That these were important discussions and issues to bring up, especially in the 70s. That's where we get like Murphy Brown and these great shows about that are based on the ideas of professional women, right? But the womanist critique said hold on, and said like the version of women's liberation that we're getting here is a white women's version of liberation. What about women who choose to be moms? What about women who want to be moms? What about the issues that women of color might face in these job in the professional world that aren't being addressed by the women's movement in this? And then we're talking like 70s and 80s, early 90s here. And then so the womanist critiques are really important. They also show up in the early 2000s in terms of like Muslim women, for example, who wear hijab, for example, and the conventional secularist, again, I say liberal democratic individualism. The conventional secularist take is that they want a separation between religion and the so-called public sphere, and so these women are sometimes the traditional Western liberal feminist version might see a woman who's wearing hijab as being oppressed by her religion, or which is patriarchal or something like that, and you have these womanist critiques that come in and say, there are other ways that we can think about that. And so Jasper Puar's book, Terrorist Assemblages, is a really wonderful, that's just a starting place if you want to think more about some of these discussions. So the first mistake that I think people make is they bring a heteronormativity to their own criticism. The second mistake is that they bring in their ideas about liberation and what it means to be independent. There's a lot of Euro-Christianism and Christianity going on there. There's a lot of focus on ideas of rationality, about political positions, about secularization, things like that. That are going into the makeup of what we think of as liberation. And we need to think about that a little bit more critically before we map it onto a character from the 1500s, or I guess early 1600s if it's Ophelia. And then the third thing is that move that I see, that I was already sort of pointing to, that we can just point to something that's wrong and stop there, right? Like, well, you're privileged, and so that's my critique. You're privileged, and it's like, I mean, the like, unfortunately, like, pointing out the problem doesn't always address the problem. So what we need to do is have a more robust way of dealing with privilege as well. And sometimes I think that we need to address the there's been a lot of focus on women, and trying to see more opportunities for women, which I think is important and ongoing. I also think that when we discuss gender critique in plays, we should look at not just the labeling of something like toxic masculinity. I think that we should unpack what are the constraints and what are the kind of affective constructions that go into the making of that toxic masculinity, if that's what we're seeing. So here's some critical questions. Even when women want to commit suicide, people tend, in patriarchal and heterosexist society, those are the people that I'm talking about, people tend to view these women's death or their death drive in heterosexist terms. And I have in my notes here, WTF here. Why can't a woman's death be her own? It's just a philosophical question. If, for those of you who know some stuff about post-colonial criticism or gender criticism, I'm hinting here at Gayatri Spivak's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, in which she's talking about women, particularly women in India, who immolate themselves, and the ways that a liberal apparatus comes to see these women's decisions in terms of heterosexist terms as well. So I'm not just talking about Ophelia as reading her intended death in the play. There's a little bit of post-colonial and gender critical history going on there. Another question I think we could ask is, Ophelia is a character who's derived from a white man, or a white Euro-Christian man, right? William Shakespeare. So she's a character derived from a Euro-Christian man's imagination. Should we simply discount Shakespeare on these grounds? Should we not see Ophelia as a viable character because she comes from the mind of a Euro-Christian man? What is the use in taking Ophelia's motivations seriously if they inherently just come from a masculine imaginary? Just things to think about. And then that begs the question of art. Can a writer ever authentically write from the position of the writer's own without merely reinscribing privilege? Can you write, or out of the writer's own imagination, right? And this happens all the time. I mean, if you're a creative writer, as some of you are, you have to deal with characters that have different genders, different sexual orientations, that different gender expressions. And how are you going to deal with those things authentically as a writer? That's Act 4, and I've kind of gone into gender criticism, which was my intention to bring in. I've done psychoanalytic criticism a little bit throughout our course this summer, and I wanted to bring up some gender stuff around Ophelia because I think there's a lot more to be said about her, and there's a lot that's been said already that I've sort of assumed or cut out here as well. So I just want to leave space for different ways of thinking about Ophelia and her actions. I do think that if we go back to Dido and to Hecuba and to Roman notions of dying a good death, that there's a way to see Ophelia as doing very much that thing. she's doing, and you could say that that's masculinist too. That's I think that that's a fair critique. But I think that I always want to come back to, as I'm reading this play, like the fact is, Ophelia did what Hamlet cannot do. And I want to give her some power for that as a character. And she's one of the only characters like who does this very authentic, and yes, it's self-violent thing. But to only see her as a victim, I think, is a problematic way of reading Ophelia's character. I'll reflect more. I'm going to make a separate video for Act 5 here, just because this feels like a natural place to stop. Thank you, as always, for listening and thinking with me. And we'll catch up with you in another video. Bye.